Hello, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Waystation. This is season 2, and I'm your host, Rebecca Darnellis. Nobody in particular, and also just like you. In each episode of the Waystation, we explore first-person stories, each told on a common theme, but from vastly diverse perspectives. We will introduce you to people whose lives seem seemingly different than yours. Or are they? Perhaps through these stories, you may find that you and me and he and she and they and them are more alike than we're willing to admit. But first, a thank you to those that make this show possible, my friends at Pioneering Collective. This podcast is powered by Pioneering Collective, an executive thought leadership firm combining personal PR, coaching, and networking to transform hard-earned wisdom into heavyweight impact. Learn more at pioneeringcollective.com. So first, we're going to start off this episode, Grief, with a little trigger warning text. This episode contains content that may be alarming to some listeners. Please check the show notes for more detailed descriptions, and please take care of yourself, fellow travelers. In this episode, we talk about grief. And there are many forms of grief. There is loss of a loved one, loss of an idea, loss of an identity. This episode focuses a little bit more on the loss of a loved one, and we talk about miscarriage. It was a really tough episode to get through at some points, episode where there were some tears, really mostly on my part. But at the same time, it was also really healing, because one of the things that we talk about is how nobody wants to talk about grief. So when you're grieving, it's very isolating. And I talk firsthand about my experience with my miscarriage in October. In fact, at this point, I would have been giving birth to a child on May 22nd, 2022. That was my delivery date. And when I had this experience back in October, it was very isolating, but also shocking because I didn't know what to expect because nobody told me what to expect. And I think that's the case for a lot of people because we don't talk about grief, because we don't talk about death, we don't talk about miscarriage, we don't talk about loss. When it happens to us, we don't have the language and we don't know the actions that we can take to take care of ourselves through this process. And I'm really grateful that Jordon and Vanessa and Arden were able to sit with me today to talk about their experiences with grief. And I hope you can relate. I am super excited today to welcome into the Waystation Vanessa Shealy, Arden Cartrette, and Jordon Ferber, 3 very real people with very honest, very true stories about their experiences with grief. Now, this is not a light topic, so I appreciate you all sitting in with me on this and talking about it. I think that we can hopefully bring a lot of healing to our listeners. I'd love to get started with you, Vanessa. First, a little bit about Vanessa. Vanessa Shealy is a writer, actor, theater creator, and communications director. She's originally from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and has lived in Washington Heights neighborhood of New York City for 17 years. Whenever you're ready, Vanessa, would love to hear your story about.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm so glad to be here. And it's nice to meet you, Jordon and Arden. The story that I wanted to tell today about an experience with grief that I had took place in 1991 when I was 19 years old, which, of course, I realize ages me quite a bit. But here I am as a 19-year-old, and I'm sitting on the bathroom counter at 19 in my childhood bedroom wearing nothing but like a bra and underwear with my butt on one side of the bathroom sink, and my knees are bent up over on the other side of the sink. And for the very first time in my life, I was sitting and reading the back of a bottle of Nair. Now, in case you're unfamiliar, Nair is the hair removal cream that was very popular in the 1990s. You may remember the Nair for short shorts. So Nair, hair removal cream. So at this time of the evening, it's 8 o'clock in the evening, and everyone in my family is just doing their own thing. My mom is out in the living room, and my dad is, he's probably in the kitchen having another snack. But my grandmother, who has lived with me and my family since before I was born, she was asleep in her bedroom, which is right catty corner to where I was sitting in the bathroom. So here I am, and I'm following the Nair instructions, and I rub this thick layer of this disgusting, sticky, awful cream on my entire legs, like all the way from my ankle right up to my crotch, because, Nair for short shorts. Then I rub it all over my armpits, and I figure, while I'm at it, I'm just going to put a generous portion right over here on the far edges of my upper lip. This is full exfoliation. Now, according to the Nair instructions, I'm supposed to leave this Nair on for about 5 minutes, no more than 7 minutes before you rinse it off in the shower, and it will leave my skin smooth and hair-free. the smell of Nair is just totally putrid. It's kind of like that perm smell, but like times a million. It's just an awful, awful smell. So I figure while I'm waiting for this 5-minute wait period, I just need to get out of this bathroom. And there's not a whole lot you can do while you're covered in Nair. So I decide, you know what, I'm going to go check on my grandmother. That summer, it had become my job to take care of my grandmother. I'd taken a gap year after high school. And in May, my parents had called me through my post-high school travels through Europe to come home early because my grandmother needed my attention. I called her Mama. And Mama had become very frail and she needed full-time help and my parents were both working. So I came back and it had become basically my full-time summer job to help take care of her. So my grandmother's bedroom, as I just mentioned, was connected to my bedroom by this bathroom where I was Nairing. And it served as kind of a private hallway between our two bedrooms. So all Naired up, I waddle into the room where my grandmother's laying in bed asleep. And, I was being super careful to keep my arms out and my legs really wide apart so none of my Nair-covered regions will get smeared, which means I'm sort of standing like a superhero in front of my grandma. But my eyes are glued onto her chest, like they have been pretty much every night all summer long. And I'm kind of using that X-ray vision to watch her chest rise and fall as I'd done so many times. But tonight, I just don't see it. So I stare and I stare and stare, but her chest just doesn't seem to move. I'd seen on an episode of Columbo, also popular in the 90s, that if you get a mirror and you hold it up to someone's mouth or nose and you can see if it fogs with their breath. So in my Nair-covered state, I suddenly decide to do that. So I walk over to her dressing table and there's this like fancy ornate grandma mirror. And I get it and I sort of put it under her nose and I put it at her face and I just kind of hold it there waiting for it to fog up and just kind of keep wait. And it doesn't fog up. Now, by this time, I'm nearing the 5-minute mark for the Nair, but the weight of this moment is upon me and I can't leave. I've got to be sure that I'm seeing what I'm afraid that I'm actually seeing. So I shuffle over to get this upholstered chair that my grandmother kept in the corner of her room, and I pulled it up right over next to the side of her bed. And then I kind of perch myself on the very edge of the seat, just so my butt bones are on the chair so I don't smear the Nair on the upholstery of the chair. And from that angle, I can sit perfectly still and look. I have sort of a side angle of my grandmother's chest to see if it's going to rise and fall. And I reach out and I touch her and I say, Mama, and she doesn't respond. So as I'm sitting there, I'm just thinking about over the last 3 months how I'd watched her change from this spunky, very quick-witted woman that raised me since I was a baby into this frail little bird who rarely even knew who I was. And she'd gotten so that she couldn't eat and needed to be spoon-fed, and she wore diapers. And needless to say, it had been a very, very long summer. So in this moment, as I sit and this Nair is searing my upper lip, I know, and I don't want to know, but I know this is the moment that I have been dreading all summer long. And all the times that I imagined this moment, I've never imagined it quite like this. And I become so aware of the ridiculous sight of me with this putrid cream, and my armpits are burning and my flesh is burning off. And I just start laughing. And I started laughing, and it was this huge release of emotion and release of so much fear and so much dread from her wonderful long life that I knew had been coming to an end all summer long. And I knew that her pain was gone and she finally could rest and I could finally rest. So finally, with these tears of laughter and Nair burn pain, I get up and I put the chair back in its place and I put the mirror back on the dresser and I go back into my bathroom and I take a washcloth and I just wipe off my upper lip and I wipe off my armpits and I quickly just go over to the bathtub and rinse off my legs, and I put on my clothes because I know that the very hardest part is next. And that's the part where I have to go into the living room and tell my parents that Mama has passed away, because I know that once I do that, nothing's going to be the same. So one last time, I go back into my grandmother's bedroom and I pull the covers up under her chin and I kiss her forehead and I thank her for letting me be the one to find her this way, because she always had such a great sense of humor. And I know that she waited to shed the burdens of this earthly life until I was trying to shed some unwanted body hair. And I've just always wanted to thank her for that, because those Nair burns did heal And eventually my heart did heal. And I've thought about that story, finding my grandmother as she passed away so much recently, because my mother passed away in November. And my mother's ending was very similar to my grandmother's ending. And they lived to a similar age and struggled with dementia. And for both of those beautiful women in my life, it was an absolute honor to be with them as they left this world.
Wow, Vanessa, thank you for that very beautiful, descriptive story. You're such a great storyteller. I'm a little choked up, as I'm sure a few of us are. One of the things that I was thinking about was this circle of like feminine energy in this household, like how you were coming back to care for your grandmother and you came back to care for your mother. And it was all just like this similar experiences. And the fact that you have gratitude that you can be there for both of them in those spaces. Because when I was first listening and you were like, I was 19 and I came back from this travel and I was like, oh, that sucks to take care of your grandmother who's dying, right? That's not fair. Like immediately I was like totally, I guess, immature about it.
I'm sure that I was immature about it at the time as well.
Yeah, totally. But, just what a way to be of service and to be around.
It's interesting that you say that, Rebecca, that you picked up on the feminine energy, because an aspect of the story that I didn't mention, my grandmother was the sister to a woman named Versa, who I also nursed and cared for when I moved to New York City, like 15 years later. So I had these 3 women in my life who I got to kind of help them toward the end of their life, and they're all on the same side of the family. My grandmother, my great aunt, and then my mother. And each one has taught me a little bit about the other. And that's been a very kind of a beautiful experience.
Yeah. It's great also because we don't really talk about the end of things as much as we talk about the beginning of things. So I don't feel like there's a lot of stories of like beauty and reverence when it comes to loss. Thank you. I'd love to hear from Jordon and Arden. Any thoughts that you have on Vanessa's story? Jordon, if you want to go first.
Well, is it inappropriate to ask if you were allowed to wear short shorts to the funeral?
I don't think I would have been allowed to wear short shorts. I probably wouldn't have worn short shorts back then because I was a very conservative 19-year-old. But if I had, my legs would have been quite smooth, yet burned, because I let that hair on way too long.
I think that type of stuff is also really important to realize, to recognize the humor or the absurdity of that moment, the heaviness of it, coupled with the fact that you're basically... It's almost like she played a little joke on you. I think it's great to be able to appreciate that even in that moment.
And that song really does get stuck in your head. If you dare wear short shorts, ne'er with short shorts, I remember. What about you, Arden?
The story made me think of my own grandma because the first time I ever did hair removal was with Nair in her bathroom. And she passed away when I was 13 years old. And so she would have had such humor over dying while I'm burning from there. So I related to that story, although that's not the way my experience was with her passing. The Nair definitely made me think of my own grandma, and that smell of Nair is forever ingrained in my brain. And it was the only thing she would let me remove hair with. Her rule was that I could not use razors, but I could use hair removal cream. And I'm not sure why she was so against me using a razor. Yeah, Nair reminded me of my grandma as well.
What was your grandmother's name?
My grandmother was Maudie Lowry.
Maudie, nice.
Mm-hmm. It's a good grandma name.
It is.
Yeah.
Not
How
Maud.
old was she?
She was 94 years old.
94, wow.
And when we went through her belongings after she passed away, I found a number of pieces of paper. I know I kept a couple of them where she was trying to calculate her age. So it was in 1991 and she was born in 1898. And so she was trying to do the math because, at some point, I'm sure she was trying to remember how old she was. And so it would have 1990 and then it would subtract the year. And I kept those. Very sweet.
I mean, when you think about it, it's probably like a relief to stop tracking at a certain point because there's not like I'm almost this age, I'm almost that age attached to it. All right. Well, thank you, Vanessa. We're going to move on to Jordon's story now. Jordon Ferber is a bereaved sibling, comedian, and host of the popular podcast, Where's the Grief? Born and raised in New York City, yay! In his spare time, he enjoys writing short blurbs about himself in the third person. Jordon, whenever you're ready.
It doesn't sound as good when somebody else is reading it, I think, because it's definitely not it's not third person at that point.
Well, it is third person, but it's not the same effect as someone talking about themselves in third person. Yeah.
Because that's ultimately, we all write our own bios. Well, I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me here. I've been doing stand-up comedy for about 20 years, actually 22 years now, and just coming up on 20 years of the loss of my brother, my only sibling, and been doing this podcast about 6 years, so I finally can say that I do comedy and tragedy. Yeah, my brother Russell was killed in a car accident in July of 2002. I was on vacation at the time. It was July 4th weekend. I was down in Florida with friends. We had rented a house that was right on the beach in Fort Myers, Florida. And it was 2002, so I had a flip phone that was plugged in all day while we were out on the beach, out on a boat. And I came back at about 10:30 at night and had 20 messages on my phone. And I got about through 2 of them before I had to stop and just call my parents and see what was happening, because it was the tone of the messages that I listened to was not good. So I finally got a hold of my dad, who told me that Russell had died in a car accident at 7:30 that morning. I basically lived the better part of that day without even knowing that it had happened. My brother was just about to graduate from the Culinary Institute of America with a degree in the pastry and baking arts. I remember so specifically that first phone call with my dad. He asked me what kind of funeral Russell would have wanted, and I said, I have no idea. All I know is that the cake afterwards has to be amazing. And I have kind of held on to that moment. I think when you go through a traumatic loss, that the images and it burns into your brain. You know, it's a very visceral reaction that I had that I can call it up at any time. Pretty much, I can remember it very specifically. But I hold on to the moment that I basically made a joke about the cake, because it reminded me that comedy is one of the things that has saved my life, and it has allowed me to maintain my sense of humor, my sense of finding ways to look at what the pitfalls of grief are, where my brother is certainly laughing at me. That, ha, you have to go to group therapy is very much a part of my process. So I go to a support group. I've been going to a group called the Compassionate Friends for a while. My parents started going almost immediately after Russell died. And lucky for me, there was a sibling group within our Manhattan chapter that my parents kept mentioning. And eventually I broke down and I was like, all right, fine, I'm coming to this meeting. It's not going to be helpful and we'll never have to talk about this again. And now I run that group and they don't come. So that irony is not lost on me. But I have found that it's really been helpful to find ways to talk about this the same way I talk about everything else. So with dick jokes, sometimes I think it's important to have a sense of humor about the hard shit that we go through. I tell people all the time, I go to a support group for bereaved siblings, and that's a great sentence that you can use if you ever need to get out of a conversation. It's usually followed by me being alone with my thoughts again. And that's really the hardest part about grief, is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of places or people that give you permission to talk about it in any real way, because people keep trying to find fixes or solutions or try to cheer you up, and that's not really what it is about. Grief is an ongoing process. Every day is its own battle. It's very isolating, especially losing my only brother. It was like losing a part of myself. I felt like I lost a leg and nobody could see it. And people don't take it really that seriously. You lose your brother and people say your parents must be devastated. How's your mother? And lucky for me, my parents were hyper aware that my experience was similar but parallel. So I never had a problem telling those people, well, I imagine they're doing about as badly as I am. And being able to talk about my brother has been very helpful. I think it's, weird that we don't give ourselves permission a lot of times to even talk about them, to tell the stories. If he were still alive, I would tell these stories and it wouldn't be weird. But for some reason, because he's dead, it adds that extra layer of anxiety as to whether or not it's appropriate to tell that story, or whether or not people are even listening if they know what the story, what's going on. So it's very isolating. I felt like the first couple of years, I lost a part of myself. I found it really hard to connect with friends of mine who only knew a version of me that no longer existed. I had a hard time connecting with that part of myself. I was desperately trying to hold on to a version of myself that no longer existed. But through the process of going to my Compassionate Friends group, I found a real community where I was allowed to be however I needed to be. And I was able to learn how to be myself again. And I've been really lucky that I've had a lot of comedians who have been in my corner as well. Comedians, while not necessarily known for our mental stability, I think the fact that we do talk about some of the hard stuff and we process a lot of our heavy emotions with comedy, with humor, with jokes has helped keep me level, helped keep me laughing, and helped keep the best jokes are also sad truths. And having a group of people that really listen and help to try to find different perspectives about a lot of this stuff has helped remind me what's important in my life and how I can be of service to other people who are having a hard time struggling with their own identities throughout loss. And quite frankly, I started this podcast, Where's the Grief, about 6 years ago. I like to say I interview other comedians who have also experienced loss, but it's not all comedians. I do interview other sad people too. It has felt like I came out as a bereaved person. It was sort of like I was living two separate lives before this, and I've melded the two in such a way. And I feel like I've created a real platform for myself to be able to talk about whatever I need to, whether it be jokes or whether it be moments of vulnerability and real yearning for what could have and should have been. And my parents and I, we started a foundation in my brother's memory called the Russell Ferber Foundation. We have a full 2-year scholarship in his name at the Culinary Institute at the in their pastry program. We're getting ready to do our 17th annual fundraiser this summer, which is a comedy show and a raffle and a silent auction and a whole bunch of other stuff. And that was also a real game changer in that we got to tell Russell's story with his death not being the end of the story. It really is sort of the beginning of a new chapter, and we get to talk about him a lot, and without it being weird or sad. I think is really he's very much a part of our lives. I feel very lucky that I get to continue my relationship with him as openly as I do. And I'm supremely grateful that I'm not the only one talking about some of this stuff out in the world, out on the airwaves, on the podcasts. I feel like these are important conversations to have, and I'm really grateful that there are other shows like this out there. So thank you for having me here on the Waystation.
Jordon, I'm so happy to have you here. I love that you started a podcast to talk about something that you wanted to talk about, but that was so difficult for other people to talk about. That's a lot of the reason why I started the Waystation. We don't do small talk on this show. And I am that awkward person that cannot have small talk. I always want to hear about your childhood and the challenges that you had to overcome, the struggles that you're still having. So I completely relate to creating a platform for yourself to just do that, to talk about those things. And another thing that I don't think I ever put the connection together was when someone dies, a part that is important to you, a part of you dies as well. And so people just trying to kind of gloss over that or to fix it, it's sort of like taking part in a loss of yourself, right? And I think that the alternative, maybe the better way, the easier way, is to allow that person to still be very much alive through conversations. And then you don't necessarily have to lose that part of yourself. I mean, look at everything that you're doing with the fundraising and the scholarship. That's very much keeping your brother alive. And I love the idea of just like having this relationship with him. I think that's really beautiful.
I think it's really important to keep him a part of my life. He was such a huge part of my life before, and I love being able to tell the stories. I love being able to share his energy and his impact on the world. I love that through a lot of the work that I do, his impact on the world continues.
I also think it's really interesting when you think about like how many things we forget in general. And then you talk about, and Vanessa's story, it's the smell of the nair. And you talk about like remembering exactly where you were at that moment when you were having like the conversation with your dad, or you were at the beach and all that stuff. And I think about that too. And I have a really shitty memory. And I can remember when certain people have passed away in my life. Oh, I had just gotten out of the shower and I was holding the towel really tightly because my friend was there and I didn't want her to, like, I didn't want to drop the towel while like she's talking to me, telling me about her sister passing away. And it's so vivid and so detailed that if you are, an artist, a comedian, a storyteller, use it. I'd love to hear from you, Arden and Vanessa. Arden, if you want to go first.
Well, I sit over here very pregnant with a second son. So, that obviously hit me for a lot of different reasons of having two boys, having a brother who's in the military, who I'm always afraid is going to die. And then we suffered a loss a few years ago of somebody really close in our family. He was young. It was an accident, something that could have just not happened and it wouldn't have changed our life, right? And when you said you lived a whole day not knowing your brother was dead, that really spoke to me because we had a normal morning and had no idea that this family member had passed away in such a tragic way. And I think that that's something we don't think of in the moment. Like, I just spent a whole day not knowing that the person I love the most was going through death. That part really spoke to me. And I'm so sorry for the loss of your brother. I wish that you didn't have to do all of these things surrounding grief. And I wish that he was here, but
Me too.
It's really special.
For all the things that I've gained in this journey, I would give it all up. I'd rather be an ignorant asshole with my brother.
Yeah.
I'm there with you.
Vanessa, what about you?
I too was thinking so much about that moment that you so beautifully described about when you picked up your cell phone and saw all the messages, and that I just felt that sinking feeling of when you see all those notifications and it's like, what's this going to be? And there's part of you that know, that anticipation of knowing, and that's just such a long moment. And that moment that you described really stuck with me. And I think it's just to echo what Arden and Rebecca have said. I think it's really beautiful. You've taken your experience and given other people an opportunity to talk about something that people generally don't feel comfortable talking about, both with humor and just frankness and just a platform to talk about it. It's like, sometimes I know Arden says she's pregnant. When I was pregnant, I remember being like, wow, I just had this realization that every person that comes into the world, somebody was pregnant. Like, I thought I was the only one who's ever been pregnant. It was such a unique moment. And I think about that with people passing away. Like, every person who lives is one day going to leave us. And you know what I mean? So it's like, it's so hard and it seems like such a giant thing to overcome. And yet it's also so common and such just a natural part of being alive, and just finding ways to talk about it with honesty. And I love that you found the humor in it. I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.
You did bring up the isolation point as well, Jordon. And as Vanessa said, this is everybody is going to experience this in their lifetime. So why is it such an isolating thing? Why aren't we talking about it more? There's so many things that we're not talking about. And it's usually the hard things. Like, where did we get this messaging that grief and death are things that you need to just deal with on your own, in your own way?
Yeah. It is. It's hard. That's the thing. Most people don't want to hear it. That's the biggest piece of advice that we get about grief is, please don't bother me with yours.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jordon. So we will move on now to Arden's story. Arden Cartrette is a bereavement doula, advocate, and writer based in North Carolina. She dedicates her work to helping women through pregnancy loss after years of infertility and loss before welcoming her living children. Whenever you're ready, Arden.
Thanks for having me. I feel like mentioning that I'm pregnant, it's like emotional carrying all the stories and then going into my own, which doesn't usually choke me up. So I'm hoping I can get through it. I've experienced a lot of loss that Jordon and Vanessa have shared today. And so I relate on levels to them. And I also hear so many parts of probably what I'm going to share, because my loss experience that I'm sharing today, it's a little different because it happened in my body. We're talking about isolation from Jordon's story and how people don't want to talk about grief. And they also don't want to talk about grief when it happens before the gestation of which a baby is normally born, right? So experience with miscarriage starts when I was a little over a year old. I don't have any memory of it because I was a year old. But my mom, she experienced a loss at home at 12 weeks. And I was home with her. She had to call an ambulance because she started to hemorrhage and go to the hospital, find childcare for me. It was a really traumatic experience that she never got to process. However, she did raise me to know that I had a sibling in heaven, as she would refer to them. And I knew that miscarriage happened. I knew not to talk about it to pregnant women, not to scare them, not telling them about my sibling in heaven or any of those things. I did go on to have a living sibling who was only 25 months younger than me. So she did get pregnant soon after and had her quote unquote rainbow baby, which is a phrase often used for a child born after miscarriage. When my husband and I wanted to grow our family, I knew miscarriage was a possibility. I didn't really think infertility would be a possibility for me because I was 24 years old at the time. You don't really hear about 24-year-olds struggling to get pregnant. Usually when you're young, they tell you to be careful because you could easily become pregnant. And so when my husband and I started trying to conceive and months went by and it wasn't happening, I felt confused. I had, regular menstrual cycles and all of that fun stuff. And after a year, we started seeing a fertility specialist and found no answers. And so we went into some testing and treatment with them and we got pregnant. And I thought, well, infertility happened to me. Miscarriage won't. That just doesn't, two things don't happen to one person. And as I briefly mentioned, we had gone through a loss of a really close family member who was only 26 in a really tragic accident a few months before this pregnancy. So whenever we had a positive pregnancy test, we wanted to believe that it was something good coming to us after a really dark time. It was the first time my husband had ever experienced depression, any grief, really. And so we were very naive and thought that pregnancy would equal a baby. But unfortunately, we went in for our first ultrasound and learned that our baby did not have a heartbeat and that we were experiencing a miscarriage. Like grief in general, we don't talk about it, so we don't really know what to expect when we experience it at any level in our life. At that moment, I started to feel grief, but I hadn't really experienced the actual loss yet. So I was grieving a lot of things. I was grieving a pregnancy. I was grieving feeling like I had to start over because it took us so long to get pregnant. I was grieving not knowing what was about to happen to me because I had my mom's experience where I just knew that there was a lot of blood, but I didn't know to what degree. I didn't know what to expect. I was only 8 weeks along, so I thought it can't be that bad. So my grieving process really started with a lot of fear. I was grieving the unknown of what the future looked like. And I decided to schedule a procedure. That way I could skip the physical part in my eyes at that moment. But I actually miscarried at home. So I experienced very similarly to what my mom experienced, even though my gestation was different. After that miscarriage, I decided I was just going to pick myself up. I was going to handle grief by shoving it down and ignoring that it was there because I wanted to be pregnant so badly. I had a taste of what pregnancy was like, and I thought I just kind of have to pick myself back up and worry about this later. I also think I gaslit myself into thinking I don't deserve to grieve because I didn't know this child. I didn't have 20 years with them. I didn't have memories. I didn't know them. I didn't know their personality or any of those things. So I told myself that it was silly for me to grieve this and just kind of picked myself back up. We went into another round of fertility treatment and got pregnant again. And unfortunately, it ended the exact same way. So I was 25 at that time and experiencing my second miscarriage. And I think that we talked about the isolating feeling. And miscarriage is so isolating. And then you have two and you have doctors telling you that you're young, so just keep trying. It'll work out one of these times. And none of that makes any sense. Instead of, finding a reason for it happening or how to prevent it, but you can't really prevent death from happening to you in any form. And I think we've all learned that the hard way, obviously. So I would say that my grieving really started after my second miscarriage. I grieved, two lives that I didn't get to know. I grieved that nobody wanted to talk about it. I grieved that if I did talk about it, it was uncomfortable for the other person, even though it was me who was living it. Nobody asked me how I felt. Nobody asked me how I was doing. But when I was pregnant and didn't know that my baby wasn't alive, people would flock to me, right? They'd flock to a pregnant, happy person, somebody who has something beautiful happening in their life. But then when you are going through the hard part, people are uncomfortable and they don't want to talk about it. The way I saw it was I experienced birth, but nobody recognized it as birth. Nobody celebrated me for Mother's Day. Nobody recognized that my whole life had changed or that my personality had changed, that there were parts of me who were now traumatized, things that people don't put any thought behind, going to the bathroom or going to sleep at night and feeling cramping or any of those things, or going to a hospital that's really well known and you have to pass it to go to work every day. Nobody realizes that when you're experiencing grief, you now have this set of trauma that other people don't see. And it's really hard to navigate that. So following my second loss, I started openly sharing on Instagram because I kind of had that feeling of, fuck this. I'm going to talk about what I've gone through and I'm going to find people who want to talk about it with me because nobody in my actual life seemed to want to bring it up or talk about it, or they were afraid to mention pregnancy or any of those things. And so I started sharing there and we went into doing more fertility treatment after I did a lot of testing and a lot of second and third opinions and still found no reason. So I was told to basically just try one more time, try again, see if it has a different outcome. And I went into a third pregnancy thinking there's no way this is going to have a different outcome, but here we go. And it did. It gave me my son, Cameron. So I experienced pregnancy after recurrent pregnancy loss, which was a special type of hell, as I like to put it, because it's a really scary time. I think the grief I felt with my miscarriages taught me that life is so fragile. And I think that the stories today also show that life at any age, it's so fragile, and death just happens, and you have no warning of it. You have no idea it's going to happen to you or how it's going to impact your life. And so once my son Cameron was born, I still had grief. I thought that having a baby would heal that grief, and I didn't realize the effects of my grief and my trauma. So I actually became a birth and bereavement doula. I focus on miscarriage. I offer virtual services to women who are experiencing miscarriage, group services, things like that. And my whole idea going into that was I'm going to give people a safe place to talk about miscarriage, the details that other people don't want to hear about, the blood, the trauma, the memories like Jordon and Vanessa are sharing where they smell Nair or they remember their phone ringing and having multiple messages. Those little moments in pregnancy loss, sometimes that's all we have of the child that we lost because we didn't get to know them. And so having a safe place to talk about those little memories that are really big to us, but really small to other people. That's kind of what I went into it with. And as I mentioned, I am pregnant again, so we didn't experience more loss. Pregnancy is forever changed for me. It changed my motherhood experience. It made me more patient, but it also made me more fearful. And it's a grief I learn to live with every single day. It changes throughout every stage of my journey. But I find some fulfillment in helping other women through the grief because I didn't have anybody to hold my hand or to tell me that I could talk about it. And even though my mom experienced loss, she never had anybody ask her about her loss. It was 1994 when she experienced her loss, and she was young. My dad wasn't really around very much. She had nobody to talk about it with, so she was not used to talking about it to where she could even talk about it with me. And so that's actually been with me becoming a bereavement doula. She's talked about it a lot more and pulled up some of those memories, which I think has been really healing for her as well. So I think that there's something to talking about grief, and I'm so thankful that you've put this panel together and had us all share our stories with grief because it's not an easy topic. It's not one people want to click on. It's not stories that we want to hear necessarily, but a lot of people need to hear them. So thanks for having me here today to share mine.
Thank you, Arden. And thank you for all that you do on social media, which is how I came across Arden's page and actually reached out to her to be on this show. As I expressed to Arden, I had my first miscarriage in October. So it was not the easiest listening to your story, but I appreciate it coming on. And yeah, I really related to how you were talking about how pregnancy is forever changed for you. It reminds me of having this loss of innocence, right? Because until it happens to you, you don't really think it could actually happen to you. And then it's like, oh, this is possible. It's traumatic. It's horrifying. And I think that's another really difficult part about nobody talking about it is because women don't know what to expect when they experience it. And it's a lot. It's a very traumatizing physically and emotional thing to go through. I'm not allowed to say infertility now because I'm seeing a homeopath and she doesn't want me to put that energy out there because I have been pregnant before. So that means that I'm not infertile. But I did try to have my first child for 4.5 years. So to have her was a miracle for me. Yes, all children are miracles, but for me, this was like the ultimate miracle, right? And then to go from that to just trying for a little over a year for the second one was like, I was like the luckiest person in the world. And then losing that pregnancy, losing that child, you do kind of gaslight yourself. Yeah. I found myself saying things like, well, you have this beautiful other child. You should feel lucky because you're 39 years old and you should have done this earlier if you really wanted to have more than one. So count yourself fortunate that you at least have one.
I like to say that I know that we gaslight ourselves, and that's something I've come to terms with lately. I've realized in therapy that I do that to myself, and I've done it for years. I also think that society gaslights us into thinking that at 39 years old, you have to have your whole family and you can't have children after that. Or I definitely relate to that feeling of trying for a year. I would think that was like, wow, only a year at this point? You kind of get into that mindset to where you think that this for you just takes forever. Mm-hmm. It's horrible. And we're also not properly educated on our bodies, which doesn't really help. There's no education for reproductive anything or women's bodies in general. I remember I had a male doctor tell me to expect a heavy period and that's all it would be. It was not. It was the furthest thing from it. And now that I do have a living child, I think that's what pushed me to do this, was that validated that I went through birth.
Mm-hmm.
It just didn't look like everybody else's version of it.
Yeah.
And so I wish that we, from the very beginning of loss, were just, I don't know, coddled a little more, like given some sympathy.
In general, dying is something people don't want to talk about. I don't know if it's because then they have to like cope with the fact that they're going to die someday. But especially when it comes to miscarriage and women's bodies, it's I'm not going there. And I think it is really helpful to have some of the more details of what women experience, which is what you're shedding light on, because I myself didn't realize that I had given birth until I saw like you post something. And I also didn't realize that what I was experiencing right afterwards was having postpartum. Because, that's right, my body did develop all of these hormones. My body was getting ready to have a child. Now that child is no longer in me, I am experiencing a postpartum period, which is another period that women are not like paid enough attention to either. People want a baby and that's it. They just want to focus on the baby.
Yeah.
Vanessa and Jordon, if you want to weigh in. Jordon, and I'll go with you first.
Well, I'll just say a couple of things. First off, I think it's important to remember that grief and joy and gratitude coexist with each other. You're allowed to feel both at the same time. And I think it gets very complicated when they're wrapped up in things like this. Part of the reason that we don't talk about a lot of this stuff is that we have no vocabulary for it. It's why it's such an alien experience. I was struck by what you said when you said that you were experiencing grief, but you didn't really know it. I think we don't know what it feels like. And so we try to convince ourselves that it's anything else, or try to put it in terms that don't fit, because that's not what it feels like. I'm just trying to
find. There's also just such a wide range of emotions. Like Vanessa talked about, like hysterical laughing at one point.
Yeah.
Like there's so many different reactions that people can have, and there's not an understanding that like all of those are grief.
It really was the process of going to talking with other bereaved people that I started to gain a vocabulary for how I felt. And I think it's really hard to deal with our own feelings when we don't have any real tangible way to talk about it. The other thing that I really liked that you were talking about, how, it just reminded me that I've met a lot of other bereaved siblings who have lost, whose parents had miscarriages prior to their births. And a fair number of them grew up with that energy in the house. Like they knew that they had a sibling that died, and, they had a name. And it's heartwarming to know that there are still ways that you can talk about those children as a part of your life, despite not having had any what might be traditional ways of talking about spending time with a child like that. Kind of warms my heart to know that energy is brought forward as a way of remembering that this was a person and that this was a part of the family, regardless of how much time we get to spend with them.
That's a really great way of putting it. And I grew up knowing I had a sibling in heaven, and I would always feel like a part was missing from our family. But my mom also says that I've always been like a creative. I've always had like an imagination, and I've been a writer and all those things. And so she knew that would kind of stay with me. And when I was younger, I used to think, I wish I had that sibling here instead of my brother, because my brother smells and I don't like him very much. But then I learned to love my brother, and now I'm so thankful that he is here, and I know he wouldn't be here if my mom didn't have a miscarriage. And I think that was my first introduction to that type of grief, of being thankful for what you have, but sad for what feels like it's missing. And that's something in my motherhood journey that I've experienced since day one. I'm so thankful for my sons, but I wonder who the babies would have been. And that's a confusing part. But it's also, I've lost my grandma, who when I grieved that loss, I could hold on to memories. I could hold on to her smell and all of these things. And I think that's why I didn't realize at first that I was grieving, because I didn't have anything to hold on to except for trauma. And that was so confusing.
Yeah, it feels like you're grieving for an idea. Like you're grieving the plans that were lost, and like the image you had of who this person was going to be when they were actually like on the physical earth.
Yeah.
And it's also, I like that perspective of realizing that, at some point your brother stinks, but now it's a familiar scent.
It's a very familiar scent.
Vanessa, I'd love to hear from you as well if you have anything.
I too is thinking about that idea of grieving what could have been, and how hard that is to talk about with other people. And I think too, just like we don't have a vocabulary to talk about grief and there's no one way to experience grief, for those around you, it's because there's not this vocabulary, it's hard for them to know how to engage you, because what's triggering to one person might not be triggering to another person. And so I think that's a lot of times why people hold their tongues, because we have this idea that if I just say nothing, I can't say something wrong. And that kind of wanting to find a way to tell people, if you just get me to talk about it, that's what I'm looking for. Is I'm looking
Right.
for an avenue to be able to talk about it. It's not so much about what you say. It's about giving me an opportunity to just share with you the way I'm feeling, which is, I think, really important. And I thought it was so interesting, Arden, to hear you talk about, and I love that you're sharing so much about your experience with miscarriage. I am a rainbow baby. My mother had 3 miscarriages before me, and we talked about that. And Jordon, you mentioned too that energy was very rich in our household. It was a story told many, many times throughout my childhood about being a miracle baby and whatnot.
My mom calls me her miracle baby as well. She had a number of miscarriages before me.
Yeah. It never occurred to me that I felt grief, but I did wonder, which is its own form of grief. I really wondered and would imagine those people, which as a child is kind of the way I processed it. But yeah. I really loved hearing both of your stories. They were really beautiful and touched me a lot.
You bring up a really good point, Vanessa, also about people not knowing what to say. So I'd love to hear from each of you what's most helpful for people to ask you or to say to you when you're grieving. Jordon, if you want to go first.
Well, I'll say for some reason, people focus on the death part. How did they die? What are the circumstances of their death? And for some reason, I think it's because people want to try to convince themselves that they can rationalize why that's not going to happen to them.
Yeah.
I think that's where it comes from. But I usually tell those people, I'm not interested in talking about my brother's death. That's not a part of his life. If you want to talk about his life, I got all day. I got lots of stories about that. I think it's hard to figure out what that balance is for other people. My mother's email signature for about 5 years after Russell died was, if you mention my child's name, I might cry. But if you don't mention it, it will break my heart. There really isn't any right thing to say. There are a lot of wrong things to say. But I think just acknowledging the elephant in the room, saying, hey, I know there's nothing to say, but I'm here. That's kind of all that needs to be said. And then you have to be there. You have to also be there. Because there really isn't anything that you can say. I think sometimes it's really just more about knowing that that I'm not crying alone.
Yeah. What about you, Arden? What's helpful to hear?
I would say I would love for somebody just to say, I'm listening. Tell me about your miscarriage experience, and to feel that that's a safe place. Or being pregnant after loss and talking about that type of grief. I wish that somebody would have not, steered away from talking about miscarriage as if that would make it happen again whenever I was pregnant. And I think that people, they really focus on positive vibes and putting only good thoughts out there, that they don't want to talk about death as if that's what's going to bring it into our life. But sometimes we just want to talk about it. But it's like what Jordon said, if you're going to say, I'm here for you, be there. But it doesn't always have to be a verbalized thing. Just be there and be a safe place for somebody to talk about what they've been through and not offer advice unless asked for advice. And sometimes I make a joke. I guess it's not really like a joke that everybody would understand. But whenever I'm talking to people, I say sometimes all we can say is miscarriage sucks. And so sometimes all we can say is that really sucks. That sucks that happened to you. And sometimes that's enough just to live in that moment of somebody validating that what you've gone through really sucks.
Agreed. What about you, Vanessa?
For me, the same. As I shared, my mom recently passed away in November. One of the things that warms my heart the most lately is when people say, tell me about her, afraid to hear me talk about her, and aren't worried that I'm going to burst into tears if they mention it, and just kind of have an avenue to cry about it if I want, but mostly just to remember her. I think that so often we think grief is supposed to end, that you're supposed to get over it. And grief is something that you're supposed to be moving past so that you're not thinking about it. And if you've lost someone close to you that you loved very dearly, a huge part of grief is remembering that person and wanting to tell people about them and remember their life and remember the wonderful things about them. So that just kind of an avenue of talking about it and not being afraid of the emotion wrapped around it.
Thank you. All right. So rapid fire questions. I am going to have each of you in the hot seat at some point. You'll all go first at some point. First, we're going to start with Jordon. Jordon, what is the best meal you've ever had, either because of the food itself, the company you were with, or the experience of it?
Oh, well, I'm going to mention a soup that my brother made. When my brother was a chef, he was working at a restaurant in San Francisco in the Transamerica Pyramid called Redwood Park, and they made a roasted chestnut and foie gras soup that I have yet to try its equal. It was my brother's 21st birthday, and his boss, the owner of the restaurant, let him off for the night. Russell's birthday was New Year's Eve, and his boss told him, this is the last birthday you're going to be able to spend outside the kitchen. And it's only because it's your 21st birthday and your family's here that I'm letting you out, because New Year's Eve is a big night in the restaurant industry. But that soup I can still taste it. That's how good it was. I yearn for it. It will never be again, I don't think. I don't know how I can get another bowl of that soup, but
yeah, I'm even trying to imagine how foie gras works into a soup.
I'm not even a foie gras guy. I don't like foie gras, but this soup was the chestnut, it was delish.
Awesome. What about you, Arden? Best meal you've ever had?
I would say it's between a meal I had at the Outer Banks. I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but I think it was the Black Pearl. And I believe that is from a history book. That might not be the name of it at all. But it was a stuffed salmon dish, and it was really good. But it's between that and the last time I was in New York City. I was born in New York, and so I visited to go to a show or something. And I went to the meatball shop and had some meatballs in some marinara sauce, and it was delicious. So it's between those two very different tastes.
Stuffed salmon or meatballs. What about you, Vanessa? Best meal you've ever had?
Well, the only thing that popped into my mind, probably because Jordon started talking about soup right away, was not so much the best meal because of it, the way it tasted, but because of the experience. When I was young, I went on this trip to Europe, and I was with all these young people, and we were in Budapest, and we were all served this bowl of soup. And we were trying to be very polite, and everyone waited until everybody got served. And it was just like a big bowl of soup. It was very cloudy, so you couldn't really see into it. It was like a thick cream kind of soup. And so once the last person was served, we all picked up our spoon and put our spoon into it. And almost in unison, we all dipped in and pulled up an entire chicken claw, just the whole thing. And the collective gasp in the room, this horror that turned into laughter we were just beside ourselves with laughter. And of course we ate this soup later. It was very good. But that it was just that moment that made that meal the best meal ever. That's all I can think
You weren't
of.
really expecting a claw to come
Not at
out.
all. And it was just it was this collective moment where the realization of that, it was very, very funny.
Awesome. All right. Next question is for Arden. Arden, what's a popular opinion most people have that you don't agree with?
Oh my gosh, you want to get me in trouble. I have to think about that. Popular opinion. I'm going to stick with the grief topic, and I'm going to say that not everything happens for a reason. That's the first thing that came to mind, because I feel like that is everywhere, and that's not true. The world is chaos. Bad things happen to good people. Life sucks sometimes.
I totally get it. I think there is just such an addiction to knowledge for people that it's I have to know exactly why. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I guess, at the end of the day about control.
I really hate that phrase, everything happens for a reason. I like to say people who say everything happens for a reason will still ask you why if you punch them.
Right. What about you, Vanessa? What's a popular opinion most people have that you don't?
Kind of in this similar vein, I always think about that idea that we hear a lot when people talk about if you just believe in yourself, you can do anything. That if you just do your positive affirmations, then all of your wishes will come true. I think that's just very capitalistic on the side of the self-help industry. I don't think that's always true.
Yeah. Jordon? Popular opinion?
Well, everybody says fuck Tom Brady, but it's, you know what? Just enjoy your life. We're all cheering on these millionaires that don't care about us. Just go to a game, enjoy a sandwich. I don't know if that's too jokey of an answer. I don't know. I think being an adult is overrated. And I think that the two things that we take most for granted as children that we don't, that we appreciate more as an adult are naps and apple juice.
Totally. All right. Next question is for Vanessa. Vanessa, what piece of art, book, music, movie, whatever, had a profound impact on you?
Wow. The first thing that comes into my mind, this is supposed to be a speed round, is my favorite book is the Prayer for Owen Meany book. I love that book. And it's interesting to me now that I love that book so much, and it really profoundly affected me. And if you haven't read it, it's about this young boy named Owen Meany. And fast forward later, 10 years after I read that book, I have a child with autism. And so I've often thought back to that book and compared the experiences of Owen Meany to my life now, and it's sort of like there's a lot of synchronicities,
Parallels.
that are sort of like, wow, that I was so drawn to that book before I ever had a child, and then I had a child that was sort of had a lot of similar thought patterns and everything like that. That's my favorite.
Yeah. What about you, Jordon?
The two books I think that changed my worldview the most, first was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and that whole series. It really was, I was already a big comedy fan, and it just spoke to me in so many ways. And obviously, it opened my eyes to a lot more types of humor and the universe. And then R. Buckminster Fuller's Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth kind of blew my mind and continues to, if you ever have a chance to get through it. It's kind of dense reading for such a small volume, but it is pretty perspective shifting.
Awesome. Arden, what about you?
Okay, mine feels really dark, but the book that made me want to be a writer because of the style, and I really liked how it shared the main character's thoughts in a different form, was a book called Speak, which was later turned into a Lifetime movie, but the book is amazing. And it's about a young girl who is sexually assaulted, and she is going through depression, and it's about her thoughts of the world around her. She felt very isolated, and I think that just always spoke to me from a young age, her thoughts going into the book. But also the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind probably is one of my all-time favorite movies. I think that it always makes me think and cry a whole bunch. And it's something that I watch when I'm looking for a little escape, but also a reminder that I don't want to erase the bad parts of my life too.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Jordon, what's your favorite thing about yourself?
Oh boy, you're asking
a comedian.
Is there anything I like about myself? I guess my favorite thing about myself is that I am pretty good at rolling with the punches that life hands out. I'm good at adapting and making do with what I have in front of me. I think that's probably my favorite thing about myself, and that I'm constantly looking forward to whatever the next new moment might be.
It's admirable. Arden, what about you? What's your favorite thing about yourself?
I want to say my resilience, but I'm not just talking about miscarriage. I feel like had a lot of different parts in life where depression and anxiety and mental health and OCD has knocked me down, but I somehow wake up the next day. And I think sometimes that's not very easy to do.
Sometimes that you're just lucky if you brush your teeth.
Yes.
Vanessa, what about you? What's your favorite thing?
On this one, we're all kind of on a theme, because I was going to say my ability to heal, both in an emotional and psychological way, but also physically. I just had hamstring surgery, and I went for my post-op appointment yesterday, and I was getting bragged about by my surgeon, who was very impressed that my incision had already healed so well. There was all this, let's take her blood and figure out what happened, that her incision's totally healed.
Why don't you just brag about it, Vanessa?
I'm bragging about it. I am absolutely bragging about it.
All right. Arden, last question.
Shoot.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
The best piece of advice I've ever been given. Oh my gosh, that's really hard. I'm trying to think. The best piece of advice I've ever been given. Oh my gosh, what? I feel like I got the hardest question to start off with.
Oh, yeah, you also got the popular opinion one first.
Yeah, you're just
kind
giving
of
me all the hard
Arden.
ones. Best piece of advice. This is not on theme whatsoever, but when planning my wedding that was very stressful, and not even a big wedding, so it had no reason to be as stressful, somebody told me that in life I'm going to have to pick my battles with every person I come in contact with, and that has deemed to be true. To pick my battles and to choose which ones are worth fighting.
Yeah.
I don't know.
The way I think about that is, would I rather be right or would I rather be happy?
Exactly.
I mean, I would want to be both, but...
Would love to be right all the time, but
Yeah.
sometimes
Yeah.
I just need to be happy.
Totally. What about you, Vanessa? Best piece of advice you've ever been given?
This is probably not true, but the only thing I could think of is the advice to drink a full glass of water when you wake up in the morning.
I think that's great.
Yeah, it sets.
I've always heard
just
that,
sets
but I've
your
never
day.
done
I'm a big water junkie.
It sets your day off. It's also just, I did something I was gonna do.
Yeah, you could
That's
check
it.
it off.
Yeah, and I'm already
It
off.
is.
I did
You mean-
something
It
I
is.
was gonna do.
I mean, you don't start the day with a full pot of hot black coffee?
after the water.
Yeah. I don't let myself drink coffee until I've had actually like 32 ounces of water. But
Oh my
I am a
gosh,
water
I need
junkie.
that type of discipline in my life. I go straight for the coffee.
Well, that's why the water thing works out so well, is because it's just so easy, and you can do it while the coffee is brewing.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, so that's
That's
an
true.
addendum.
All right. very last response to the very last question. Jordon.
Well, I'm going to give the two pieces of advice that I've gotten as a comedian. The first one was learn a trade. But the second one, the real one, is really I try to apply this to other parts of my life as well, but it works more in, this one guy told me that the key to real comedy is to improv it for yourself, to always be excited to share this idea with an audience, to always be genuine and connected to the idea. You have your idea and you have your punchline, and there are 1,000 ways that you can get there. And you have to keep it interesting for yourself so that you are always excited to tell the joke. Because if you're just doing the material by rote, you become like a trained monkey who's not even happy there's going to be a treat at the end anymore. He's just happy there's not going to be a beating.
That is also true of life.
Yes, I try to apply. I think that, so much of my comedy and my grief process have been parallel. And I think that there are a lot of concepts within each one that can apply to the other. And I try to apply them to, other parts of my life. I think being able to find ways to be genuine and be in the moment and be real with a person when and listening to what they're saying, as well as wanting to connect and not just waiting for the moment of empty space where I get to jump in and talk. I think it's important to have that real connection with what you're talking about and who you're talking to. There's no substitute for that.
Yeah. I think it's why we all three at least do what we do. Thank you so much, everyone, for speaking with me today. It hasn't always been easy in this conversation, at least for me, but I appreciate you holding this space with me. Thank you.
Thank you.
So there you have it, fellow travelers. I hope that this was somewhat of a healing conversation for you. I hope that you found some peace in the community that we created to talk about this, a sometimes really difficult topic to talk about, because the fact of the matter is the onus is really placed on the individual to get through grief all by themselves, and that's a heavy burden to carry. So the more that we talk about this, the more that we release some of the burdens from ourselves and carry it with the collective universe. And then things are not so heavy. Thank you very much for sitting with us today. I do want to invite you to subscribe to the Waystation on Apple and give us a rating. The more ratings that we have, the more visibility that we have, the more visibility that we have, the more that we can continue these conversations on a greater scale, which is really the goal with the Waystation, is to have these conversations so we can each individually feel a little less alone. So feel free to have a conversation with us on social media, on Facebook or LinkedIn at the Waystation Podcast, or on Instagram at the Waystation Pod. We are here. We are listening. We want to hear from you because we love you. Let's chat. Till next time, fellow travelers.